may be right. I may be crazy, but it just may be a lunatic you're looking for. Those aren't my words. Those were the words of the famous Billy Joel, a song called You May Be Right that was released in March of 1980 on one of my favorite rock albums of all time called Glass Houses. Now, whether or not you think Billy Joel is crazy, whether or not you think I'm crazy, whether or not you think you're crazy, you may actually think that a guy named David McNeil is crazy. See, David McNeil is a Chicago billionaire, the founder of WeatherTech. I don't know whether you're familiar with those floor mats and those cup holders, but he's made a lot of money selling those. And you may think he's crazy because in June of 2018, he bought a new car. And it wasn't a new car, it was actually an old car. It was new to him. It was actually a 55-year-old used car. And the car that he bought in June of 2018 was a 1963 Ferrari 250 GTO. It was serial number, or it is serial number 4591 GT. Now, if you had bought this Ferrari brand new from the factory in 1963, the Ferrari 250 GTO, serial number 4593, you would have paid $18,500 for this car. There's actually, you needed more than money to buy the car. You needed two things. You needed $18,500, and the second thing you needed to buy a Ferrari 250 GTO in 1963 was you needed the permission of the Il Commendatore. Il Commendatore is Enzo Ferrari, the namesake and founder of Ferrari motor cars, and he is very Italian, and in order to sell you his car, in order for you to buy it, you had to have his permission, maybe you come to me with your money, and I'd say, no, you're not good enough to buy my car. Why should I sell you my car? You're an idiot. You can't drive my car. And you literally needed Enzo Ferrari himself to give you permission to buy his car. This wasn't true in 1963 if you wanted to buy a Chevrolet Impala. The Chevrolet Impala was the most popular car in America in 1963. In fact, the Chevrolet Motor Car Company made over 862,000 Impalas in 1963. 157,000 or more of them were what they called the Super Sport package, and if you bought a base 1963 Chevrolet Impala, you paid $2,661 for it. In other words, you could buy about 6 Impalas for one Ferrari, unless, of course, you bought the Super Sport package in the high-end V8 convertible configuration. Then it costs $3,195. Just so happens that at the Barrett-Jackson Auto Auction in Scottsdale in July of 2019, a 1963 Chevrolet Impala SS convertible sold for $60,000. Now, that isn't what made David McNeil crazy. What makes you perhaps think that David McNeil is crazy is because in June of 2018, he paid $70 million for his 1963 Ferrari 250 GTO, serial number 4593 GT. Now, if you are paying attention and you are of a sound mind, you may be thinking, what? Did you say $70 million? Yep, that's exactly what I said. That's a 7-0 with a comma, followed by 3 more zeros, followed by another comma with 3 more zeros. $70 million for a car. And you may reasonably ask, what in the wide world of sports makes a car worth $70 million? And if you talk to a Ferrari collector or an expert in collector cars, they will tell you, well, there's lots of factors that go into determining the value of a car. Its history and its provenance. Was it raced? Did someone famous own it? What is the condition of the car? And how many of the cars were actually made? There were only 36 Ferrari 250 GTOs made between the end of 1962 and the beginning of 1964. But $70 million for a car? How do you determine what something like that is worth? Well, you can factor in all of the things you want, but the reality is the one thing that determines what something is worth is whatever somebody is willing to pay for it. You don't believe me? I mean, if you're starving and you need a sandwich, you'll pay $100 just for a sandwich. Or if you're dying of thirst, there's no telling how much you would pay just for a drink of water. If you don't believe me, remember when we used to go to movie theaters? Remember those places you used to go and sit and watch a movie? And you would walk in and you would buy 3 cents worth of popcorn and 10 cents of a drink to get a tub of popcorn and a 55-gallon drum of soda, and it cost you $15. It's worth whatever anybody is willing to pay for it. If the check clears, then that's what it's worth. The question that I want us to wrestle with today is, what are you worth? What are you worth? You see, that's no small question, but it means everything. Depending on how you answer that question changes everything about how you see yourself, and more importantly, how you see everyone around you. See, it's my prayer today that we would stay liminal, that we would have a liminal sense of our personal accounting system, that our personal economics might be disordered, that we might reorder them in a different way. My prayer is that we might apply a new kind of spiritual accounting system that will help us determine what we are genuinely worth and what everyone around us is worth. The algorithm that we use to determine our self-worth is a tricky thing. It's a complicated thing. And sociologists and anthropologists and social psychologists and psychologists and psychiatrists and basically all ologists and in every discipline from the sciences to the humanities is contributing to how we understand our own value. And it's this algorithm, it's this alchemy, it's this complex formula that includes our experiences, our environment, our accomplishments, what we own, what we produce. It includes our biology and our genetics. And in this algorithm of calculations, we compare ourselves to others, and somehow mysteriously, we come up with a way that determines whether or not we're worth anything. And it's very fragile, and it's very fickle. And almost all of us ride this roller coaster in one moment thinking that we are the most worthless person on the earth, that nothing that we do matters, that we are the least significant person on the planet. And then something else happens, and a moment later, we think we're okay. We may think we're actually quite something. We begin to smell ourselves and say, oh, I've really got it all together. And we ride this roller coaster of this evaluation, this personal economic system like a roller coaster, wavering between we think we're priceless and we think we're worthless. People have done it since the beginning of time. In fact, 3,000 years ago, a group of people decided we're going to get off of that roller coaster and we're going to come up with a system that will define how you know what you are worth. In fact, it was the people of God who used the Torah law of Moses. And they used what God had told Moses to establish a criteria that said people who are righteous or people who are good or people who are valuable will do all of these things, and people who are not will do the opposite, or they will avoid these things. And they created a very sophisticated economic system, sort of a Torah economy, That if you kept all of the laws, if you checked all of the boxes, you knew you were a good, significant, important, valuable person. And if you failed to check the boxes, you were less significant and less valuable. For 1,000 years, the rabbinical system examined the Torah law and created pages and pages and hundreds of commands and checks and evaluations that allowed the average Hebrew person, the average Israelite, to say, I am a good person because I check all of these boxes. And in the Mishnah and the Talmud and the Torah, they came up with a solid structure that said good people are this, and worthless people are not. 2,000 years ago, there was a young rabbi who was born outside of the borders of the nation of Israel. He was born in a small town called Tarsus. But he had a heart for God and a passion for the law, and at a young age, he traveled from Tarsus to Jerusalem for rabbinical studies. And he kind of went to the Harvard Theological Business School of his day in the temple in Jerusalem and studied with the most famous spiritual economics professor of his time, a man named Gamaliel. And this young man, Saul, from the city of Tarsus, became an excellent rabbi. He was an honor student. In fact, he may have been the valedictorian of his class, and he dedicated himself to being a valuable person according to the law. About the same time, there was another young rabbi, and he was born in the northern area of Israel, born to a man named Joseph and a woman named Mary. He was born in the village of Nazareth, and as he turned 30 years of age, he took on his rabbinical calling as Yeshua ben Joseph and began to teach throughout the northern areas of Israel and throughout Galilee, and he proposed a disordering of the Torah economic system. He said that is not what the Torah was intended to do. That we do not value ourselves according to the Torah economics, and he proposed reordering the economic system in a radical way that suggested that our value was based not on what we accomplished and not on what we produced, or not how accurately we kept the commands of God, but on God's love and grace alone, that our worth was a gift. And he was so radical in this economic policy that 2 times he went to Jerusalem to the graduate school of Torah economics, and he literally turned the money tables over. And he said, we have to reorder how we think, because you are worth more than the things you acquire or the things that you do or do not do. And he was so dangerous to the economic system of the nation of Israel that they killed him for it. In fact, he was so dangerous in the eyes of this young rabbi, Saul of Tarsus, that he dedicated his life to eradicating the followers of this Galilean rabbi, Jesus of Nazareth. And after his death, he traveled throughout Israel and decided to even travel beyond Israel to find these people, to purify them, and to pull them back into the fold of the Torah economics. And he was on his way out of Israel to the city of Damascus in Syria when he had a head-on collision with that resurrected rabbi. And it was there on the road to Damascus that this young rabbi, Saul of Tarsus, had his entire personal economic system disordered and dismantled. And in that moment, he would spend the rest of his life operating under a new economy and traveling and teaching and training anyone he met to operate under this new economy of grace. It was 18 years after that head-on collision with the resurrected rabbi, Jesus of Nazareth, that now the Apostle Paul was traveling wherever he could in the Roman Empire, teaching people about this new way of accounting for their own value, for their own worth. And everywhere that he went, he would collect these people who wanted to operate under a new economy, and they formed churches, and the churches were birthed throughout the Roman Empire. And about 18 years after that collision on the road to Damascus, he wound up in the city of second chances, a city like Austin, a city in the south of Greece, a city called Corinth. And he spent a year and a half there teaching people about this new way of thinking and this new way of valuing themselves and others. And in this new economy, they started a church with the same DNA as this one, a church built on the economics of grace. But it was about 4.5 years after the Apostle Paul left Corinth that the Corinthian church began to struggle. They wanted to reinvent that old economy. They had a hard time following the new economic principles of grace, and the Apostle Paul heard about it when he was in the city of Ephesus. And so he wrote them a letter, and it's preserved in our Bibles as 1 Corinthians, or as I like to call it, First Riverbend. And he said at the end of that letter, here's the way that I want to remind you of the importance of this new economy, and I'm coming to see you. And he set out from Ephesus to make his way through Asia Minor to down the Greek peninsula. And when he got to the city of Philippi, he was maybe a month or two away from getting to Corinth. He heard that the situation was worse, so he wrote them a second letter. You have it in your Bible as 2 Corinthians, or as I like to think of it, as Second Riverbend. Over the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about what the Apostle Paul told us in that letter, Second Riverbend, and what we have as the 5th chapter. And it's there at the end of the 5th chapter that he reminds us and reminds the Corinthians of that new economic system. And he says it this way: all this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the task of reconciling people to him. For God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself, no longer counting people's sins against them. And he gave us this wonderful message of reconciliation. So we are Christ's ambassadors. God is literally making his appeal through us. We speak for Christ when we plead, come back to God. For God made Christ, who never sinned, to be the offering for our sin, so that we could be made right with him, with God, through Christ. Now, to understand what Paul is saying there theologically, economically, you only have to understand one word. It is the Greek word katalasso. The Greek word katalasso comes from a word group. Kata is the prefix and lasso is the root. And there's a half a dozen other prefixes that are attached to the root word lasso. There's apolasso and anolasso and metalasso and dialasso and katalasso. And they all mean the same thing. They all mean some kind of exchange. I like the way I read one scholar who said, all of these words indicate the desire to make something otherwise, to make otherwise, to transform it, to change it, to liberate it, to renew it, to exchange it, to transform it, to reconcile it. In secular Greek, the word katalasso was an economic term. And it indicated what a person did when they came to an agreement over the value of an item, when they reconciled the cost. Now, I don't know, do any of you still reconcile your bank statements? Does anybody still do it here? I mean, I'm old school. I actually have my bank and my credit card send me paper statements. I still like it. Every month they're like, please, let us do it electronically. I said, no, I want the paper, because I literally check off the charges that my credit card company says I've acquired during the month. I literally go through and I have my record on my QuickBooks, and then when they send me this, I go through and with the red pen, I know, I'm old school, I'm analog, I'm a dinosaur, but it allows me to look at what I have a record of and what the bank says I have a record of and say, I have what they say I have. That's what katalasso means. Katalasso means exactly that. Katalasso means you have what God says you have. You are what God says you are. Not the old accounting system that says you are what you accomplish, or you are what you possess, or you are the sum of your genetic makeup. None of that. He says you are what I say you are. And how do you know that you are what I said you are? Because I was willing to pay the price for you. And the price I paid for you was everything. So if I say you're priceless, you're priceless. Look at 2 Corinthians, what Paul says here to us in 2nd Riverbend. And look at the word katalasso, because it appears 5 times in 3 verses. He's kind of hitting us upside the head and saying, pay attention to this. He says, all of this is from God who katalassoed us, who reconciled, who said, you are priceless to himself, through Christ, who gave us this task of katalasso, reconciling people to him. For God was in Christ, katalasso, reconciling the world to himself, no longer counting people's sins against them. And he gave us this wonderful message of katalasso, reconciliation. So we are Christ's ambassadors. God is making his appeal through us. We speak for Christ when we plead, come back, or be katalasso, be reconciled to God. Now, how is that possible? How is it possible that God can say, you are priceless? It's because he paid the price. Because he said, I gave you the highest price I could. I sacrificed myself. And how do you know that that is true? Because the check cleared on the 3rd day. That's what he says in verse 21. He says, for God made Christ, who never sinned, to be the offering for our sin, the perfect, flawless, priceless image of God is what we are worth, so that we could be right with God through Christ. Not because of anything we do, not because of anything we are, but because God says, that's who you are. You are worth that because I said so. You have what I have. You are what I say you are. Now, if you let that sink in for a moment, that should matter to us. It's the kind of thing that is hard for us to comprehend, but we look at it and we say, that's kind of awesome. But it's not enough. Not enough for me, anyway. You see, I'm hardwired for that old economic system. I'm hardwired to evaluate myself based on my stuff, based on my accomplishments, based on my comparison to others. That I'm vulnerable. I keep running back, and even though I know, God says you are priceless. You are more valuable than anything I could tell you. You are as valuable as I say you are. I still, every week, it's going to happen today. It's already happened once. It's going to happen again. I get finished with this thing I'm doing with you. And people will come up to me and they'll say, Dave, what'd you think? Ask anybody who knows me. Ask my wife. What is my response? Oh, that was crap. That was terrible. I don't know why I do this. This is pointless. This is just a mess. Because I know what I wanted it to be. I know what I expected it to be. I expected the room to be packed. I expected tens of thousands of people, the entire city of Austin, to be watching us live. My expectations were perfection. And I never, ever, ever, ever measure up. And if I can pull myself back from the cliff of perfection, I look around, I look around at other people who do what I do, and I say, they're so much better than me. They're so much better looking. They have so much better hair. They're so much more eloquent. There's so many more people that come to their church. They're just, and I drive myself into that old economic system of perfectionism and comparison and self-pity. But God has a way of reminding me that he meant what he said. He reminded me a couple weeks ago through these two rocks. We came into the office probably a month ago, maybe 6 weeks ago, and there was a box on the reception desk. It was a plain brown box, and it had an envelope taped to it, and you know, for 5 months, there's nobody in the office, so somebody hand-delivered this and set it there, and so I opened the box, and inside the box were these two rocks. And inside the envelope was a note addressed to me. And it was from a person I have never met. A person who said that they were watching online a message a couple weeks before where I was lamenting, I was feeling sorry for myself, that my wife and I weren't going to be able to go to Colorado to go jeeping in the mountains. Perhaps you remember that exercise in self-pity from a couple months ago. I was like, oh, the COVID, it's ruining my vacation. I have to stay here in Austin. I can't go to the mountains. Well, he heard that. And the next week he was in Colorado, in his Jeep. And when he got to the top of Mount Antero, he saw this white rock, and he remembered that, what I had said, and he picked up this white rock. And a day or two later, he was up at Red Cone Pass, and he was thinking about that message again, and he picked up this rock, and he put him in the box, and in his note, he said, I've never been to Riverbend. He said, I'm not a member of your tribe, but I can tell you I've been going through a tough stretch. And this season has been really difficult, and what you said helped me. And it encouraged me, and thank you for doing that. And in that moment, I realized that the economics that God uses to evaluate our significance have nothing to do with the way that we evaluate it. Because God sees the whole picture. And in the whole picture, there are no insignificant pieces. There are no unimportant bits. Because in the depths of the intricacies of the universe, the tiniest little mainspring, the most insignificant gear matters. And God understands that because God sees the whole economy, and he knows that every piece is essential and valuable and necessary. And there are no insignificant cotter pins on a spaceship. Every one of them, no matter how small, keeps the whole thing together. They all matter equally. And what katalasso means is that we have been exchanged for the priceless Son of God. And that is what we are worth. Priceless. Why? Because God said, that's what I'm willing to pay for you. And just to make sure that you know you were worth it, the check cleared on the third day. And you see, we find our value. We find an ultimate affirmation of that significance as we realize that we have things to contribute to those around us, that our lives matter. Maybe in the smallest of ways, but no one we meet isn't significant. No one. Everyone is. He tells us that he has given us this wonderful message of katalasso, reconciliation. So we are Christ's ambassadors, and God is making his appeal through us. That we have been given this opportunity to do what Paul did, what Saul of Tarsus in that head-on collision on the road to Damascus experienced when he ran into this resurrected Savior who reoriented his entire world, who reordered everything he was, who took that old economic Torah system of you are worth it because you do these things and you avoid these things and you practice these things, and he reordered it and made it new and said, now you will operate in the economy of grace. And he gave Paul that message and that mission, just like he's given it to us. The algorithm that we typically use to determine our self-worth is made up of all kinds of scientific and biological and psychological components. And we roll into that comparison with others and evaluations of our history and our potential and our environment and our genetics. And we create this alchemy that comes away with this idea of this is what we are worth because we are, or we have, or we accomplish all of these things. But that is fragile and frail. And it throws us into a centrifuge that spins us between pricelessness and worthlessness. Paul says there's a different economy. There's the economy of grace. It says you are priceless because God was willing to pay the price. You are what he says you are. You're worth what he says you're worth. Just like a Ferrari 250 GTO. In 1963, early 1963, Il Commendatore sold a Ferrari 250 GTO. It was serial number 3589 GT to a French racing team. And the French racing team campaigned this dark blue Ferrari 250 GTO for the better part of a year. And then they decided to move on to a different car, and they sold it. And they sold it to a Texan. They sold it to a racing hobbyist and an oil man from Victoria, Texas, named Tom O'Connor. And Tom O'Connor had as a hobby his desire to race cars, so he built a racing team around his new 250 GTO and campaigned it for a year. But as anybody who's been in the oil and gas business any length of time knows, there are days when you're riding high and days when you just got to get out. And for tax purposes, he had to give away his Ferrari 250 GTO. So he gave it to his alma mater, his high school in Victoria, Texas. He gave a 1963 Ferrari 250 GTO to the booster club of Victoria High School in Victoria, Texas. Well, they kept this Ferrari 250 GTO for a number of years, and they used it in their Votech shop, and they drove it around in parades, and they put it on display. But as anybody who has ever owned a Ferrari will tell you, they cost you money just sitting still. And so the board at Victoria High School, in all of their collective wisdom, says, we got to dump this car. We'll have a sealed envelope auction for our Ferrari 250 GTO that was donated to us. And so in 1967, they decided to, or no, it was like 7 years later, they decided to have a sealed envelope auction. And a man named Joe Corcoran from Cleveland, Ohio, won the bid. He paid $6,500 for the Ferrari 250 GTO number 3589 GT. And he had this idea that he was going to have an exotic rental car company in Cleveland, and he rented out the GTO, you could drive it, for $34 a day. But he soon found out, what the people at Victoria High School found out, that having a Ferrari costs a lot of money. So after 2 years, he put the Ferrari on a trailer and parked it in a field behind his house, where it sat for 14 years. Collectors would come to him regularly and say, do you want to sell us this Ferrari? And they threw all kinds of money at the guy. And he said, no, 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 I'm going to get it around. I'm going to get around to fixing it up, getting around to fixing it up. And it wasn't until 1988 that a Swiss investment banker named Engelbert Steiger came and threw $4.2 million at him that he said, yeah, that'll do it. But the car had been sitting out for 14 years. It was a pile of rust. And Steiger spent $1 million restoring the car to like new condition. I read an article this past week by an expert in Ferraris, and he basically said that Ferrari, should Steiger ever want to bring it to market, could conceivably be worth $100 million. I was out at 70 million. I don't know about you, but I'm not going a penny over what David McNeil paid for his car. $100 million for a car. The economics of that is insane. The Apostle Paul understood that, and he understood that the economics he was proposing, the economics of grace, are equally crazy. In fact, he began the section we started looking at here in 2nd Riverbend by saying this: if it seems we are crazy, it is to bring glory to God. And if we are in our right minds, it is for your benefit. He may be right. We may be crazy. But he just may be the lunatic we're searching for.